Dr. Elias West, a skilled human doctor, had never expected his routine mission to go wrong. His ship was designed for long-distance space travel, equipped to handle almost any emergency, but nothing had prepared him for the sharp jolt that sent the craft spiraling toward an unknown planet. His world spun into chaos as alarms blared, and the ship's control systems failed one by one. Panic set in as the ground grew closer with terrifying speed. The last thing Elias remembered was hitting the cold metal floor of the cockpit, his vision blurring as the crash became inevitable. When he awoke, it was to the strange smell of unfamiliar air. The sounds of the forest surrounded him, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in a way that felt almost dreamlike. For a moment, he thought he was still dreaming. He tried to move, but was met with a sharp pain in his side. Slowly, Elias turned his head to assess his situation. The wreckage of his ship lay scattered around him, pieces of metal and glass half buried in the dirt. His body was bruised, but nothing seemed life-threatening. He was alive. A soft, rustling sound drew his attention to the side. Through the smoke and debris, Elias saw a figure approaching. He froze, not sure if his mind was playing tricks on him. The figure stepped into the clearing, and Elias gasped in surprise. It was an alien. She was tall and slender, her features unlike anything Elias had seen in his years of deep space research. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale shade of blue, and her eyes, large and deep, seemed to hold a quiet intelligence. Her hair, long and flowing, was a silver gray, catching the light in a way that reminded Elias of starlight. She knelt beside him, her movements graceful, almost as if she were gliding across the ground. Despite her alien appearance, there was something undeniably human about her, a calmness in her eyes, and empathy in her expression. Elias tried to speak, but his voice came out in a weak rasp. Who are you?" His throat felt dry, and his words came out broken. The alien woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gently placed her hand on his arm, studying him with a focused gaze. She spoke then, but the words were in a language Elias didn't understand. Her voice was melodic, soothing even, but completely foreign to him. He blinked, confused. "I don't understand," he whispered, feeling helpless. His thoughts were a blur of questions. What was this place? Was she a friend or foe? How had he ended up here? The woman seemed to sense his confusion. She looked down at his wounds, then at the wreckage surrounding them. Without hesitation, she moved to the scattered pieces of the ship, retrieving a small glowing device from one of the compartments. It looked nothing like the medical tools Elias had on his own ship. Yet, when she touched it to his side, Elias felt a cool sensation spread across the wound. The pain dulled almost immediately. Surprised, Elias winced. "What is that?" he asked, still struggling to understand what was happening. The alien woman didn't respond with words, but instead gave him a soft, reassuring smile. She reached into a pouch at her side and retrieved what looked like a small, transparent leaf. Without explanation, she pressed it to his lips. A strange, sweet liquid trickled into his mouth, and Elias felt an instant wave of relief as his body absorbed the nourishment. His strength slowly returned. The woman was silently attentive, observing Elias closely. Though she didn't speak, it was clear she was trying to help him recover. But who was she? And why was she here? The thought crossed his mind. He wasn't alone. Despite being stranded on an unknown planet, Elias wasn't entirely helpless. This alien woman seemed to be as much a stranger to this world as he was. And yet, she was helping him, treating him as if his survival mattered. But what if she was also lost? What if she had no way of returning to her home either? Elias knew his first priority was survival. He had to assess his situation, find shelter, and figure out how to survive. The wreckage of the ship was scattered across the area, but it didn't seem like anything could be salvaged immediately. The planet itself, strange and unfamiliar, seemed to stretch endlessly around them. I don't know how to thank you," Elias said, still catching his breath, though his voice was stronger now. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. She didn't seem to want gratitude. Her eyes reflected a kind of understanding, as if she was simply fulfilling a role she had long been familiar with, helping without expectation. After a long moment, she offered a gesture. She pointed to herself, then to him, and said something in her language. Elias couldn't understand the words, but the message was clear. She was offering her help, and perhaps in her way, she was offering her companionship. The crash had thrown Elias into the unknown, but now, amidst the wreckage and the strange, alien world, he found an unexpected ally. The days after the crash passed in a blur for Dr. Elias West. Every morning, he would wake up to find himself in a strange world, surrounded by towering trees and glowing plants. The air was thick with the smell of unfamiliar flowers, and the sky above shimmered with two suns. It was beautiful but terrifying all at once, and there was still the question of how to survive. The alien woman, whom Elias had started to think of as Lyra, was always by his side. She moved with a quiet grace, almost like she belonged to this planet. Every time Elias tried to make sense of the situation, she would simply look at him with those large, knowing eyes and offer him whatever she could. But the most difficult part of all was the language barrier. Every attempt Elias made to speak to Lyra felt like an impossible task. She would look at him curiously when he spoke, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. Elias had no way of knowing what she was saying in return. Her voice, though soft and soothing, was a series of words he couldn't understand. At first, he tried to speak to her in English, then in the few universal phrases he knew from his work with different species, but nothing worked. Her language was completely foreign to him. For a while, Elias thought it would be impossible. He had been trained to handle medical emergencies, not communication crises. He wasn't sure if Lyra would ever understand him, or if he would ever understand her. One morning, after a night spent in a shelter they had built from the wreckage, Elias tried again. He sat down on a log beside her, trying to make himself understood. Lyra, he began, using the name he had given her in his head. Do you know where we are? She looked at him with a tilt of her head, her eyes narrowing as if thinking carefully. She didn't answer in words, but she pointed to the sky and then to the ground. Elias stared at her, trying to understand. Sky, ground, he asked, unsure. Are you saying we need to find something in the sky or the ground? Lyra shook her head, still silent, but then she gestured to the wide expanse of the forest around them. She made a sweeping motion with her hand, as if showing Elias the whole world, and then touched her chest gently. Elias frowned. Was she saying something about the planet, or perhaps her home? He wasn't sure, but the more she gestured, the more he began to understand that her communication wasn't just through words. It was through the way she moved, the way she looked at him. In the next few days, Elias started to pay closer attention to her actions. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her body language told him more than words ever could. When she showed him the plants in the forest, she would point to them, and then mime actions, almost like a silent teacher. She would chew on a fruit and wait for him to try it, then smile when he understood it was safe to eat. She would show him how to use leaves to create a simple shelter, miming the process carefully and patiently. It wasn't easy, but little by little, Elias began to understand the meaning behind her gestures. It was as if her body was telling him the story that her words couldn't. One day, after a particularly long walk through the forest to find more resources, Elias sat down on a large rock, exhausted. Lyra joined him, and for a moment, they simply sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the strange creatures in the distance. Elias took a deep breath. I'm starting to understand you, he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if she could fully grasp what he meant. It's not perfect, but I think I get the message. We're both here, alone, and we have to work together. Lyra looked at him then, her expression soft. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and for the first time, Elias saw a look of recognition in her eyes. It was as if she understood exactly what he was trying to say, even without the words. She smiled then, a warm, gentle smile, and in that moment, Elias felt a spark of hope. Maybe communication wasn't as impossible as he thought. Maybe in this strange place, they could find a way to work together and survive. As the days went by, Elias learned more and more about Lyra. She wasn't just an alien. She was someone who, like him, had found herself on a strange world, far from home. Despite the language barrier, the two of them formed an unspoken bond, relying on each other more with each passing day. Elias would tend to her wounds when she scraped herself, and she would return the favor by showing him how to use the planet's resources for survival. Though the isolation of the planet was suffocating at times, Elias began to realize that this strange woman wasn't just a survivor. She was someone who understood him in ways words couldn't explain. And that, in itself, was enough for now. I kept the focus on the growing bond between Elias and Lyra, especially through their nonverbal communication. How does this version feel? Should we continue? As the days turned into weeks, Dr. Elias West began to feel the weight of his new reality. Stranded on an alien world, with only Lyra, the mysterious alien woman, to help him, he quickly realized that surviving here was going to take everything he had. The planet was beautiful, but it was also dangerous in ways he couldn't quite predict. The forest around them seemed to pulse with life. Towering trees with thick trunks and sprawling branches provided shelter, while vibrant flowers bloomed everywhere. But the beauty of the place was deceiving. Beneath the surface, it held threats that were unseen and sometimes unpredictable. Elias had seen strange shapes moving in the distance, large, shadowy creatures that watched from behind the trees, and smaller ones that scurried through the underbrush. At first, he had been terrified, but over time, he came to understand that these creatures were not necessarily aggressive. They were simply part of the planet's ecosystem, living their lives as they always had. Lyra, though, seemed to understand the planet's rhythm far better than Elias did. She moved through the forest with an ease he couldn't match, her sharp eyes spotting dangers before he ever saw them. She taught him to identify the plants that were safe to eat and the ones to avoid. She showed him how to craft rudimentary tools from the natural resources around them: sticks, vines, and leaves. All things that Elias never would have thought to use in the same way. Her hands were skilled and quick, and though her language was still a mystery to him, the way she demonstrated her knowledge spoke louder than words ever could. One afternoon, Elias watched her carefully as she knelt beside a thick patch of grass. She plucked several long, stiff blades and began weaving them together with the practiced hands of someone who had done this many times before. He had seen her do this before, but today he was determined to learn. "Lyra," he said, though the word was still strange coming from his lips, "show me how to do that." She paused and turned to him, offering a small, silent smile before nodding. She handed him a few blades of grass and mimed the actions, showing him how to tie the fibers together. Elias followed her movements carefully, his hands fumbling at first, but slowly getting the hang of it. There was something calming about the simple act of weaving, something that allowed him to focus, to forget about the strange world around him for a moment. As the days passed, Elias became more attuned to the rhythms of survival on this alien planet. He helped Lyra build a sturdier shelter using the vines and wood they gathered. They worked side by side, communicating with gestures, glances, and a growing understanding of each other's needs. Sometimes Lyra would show him something new, like a plant with soft, healing leaves that could soothe a burn or a root that could be eaten raw for a quick burst of energy. Other times, they would sit in silence, simply enjoying the peace of the forest. There was one particular day that stood out to Elias. It had rained heavily the night before, and the ground was soft, the air thick with humidity. They had spent most of the morning collecting food and supplies, but as the afternoon sun began to break through the clouds, Lyra led him to a small clearing near a bubbling stream. The water here was clearer than anywhere else, and the plants around it seemed to thrive. Elias sat down on a large rock, watching as Lyra crouched beside the water. She used a small curved stone to carefully carve at the surface of a thick root that had been partially submerged. She worked with precision, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you making?" Elias asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Lyra glanced up at him, then smiled softly, as though she understood his question. She held up the root, which now had a sharp edge, and showed it to him. She minded slicing through the air, then pointed to a thick branch nearby. It didn't take long for Elias to understand. She was making a simple knife. "Ah," he said, nodding slowly, "but tool for cutting. Clever." She smiled again, pleased by his understanding, and handed the knife to him. He took it, turning it over in his hands, feeling the sharp edge. He was amazed at how quickly she had made it, using only the resources of the planet. "You're brilliant," Elias said, surprised at how much he had come to depend on her knowledge. It wasn't just that she knew how to survive here. It was the way she had taught him. Without words, without hesitation, she had shared her wisdom, and in doing so, she had changed the way he thought about survival. It was no longer about doing everything on his own. It was about learning to work together, to rely on each other's strengths. Lyra looked at him, her expression softening. She reached out and placed her hand on his, giving him a quiet gesture of appreciation. They didn't need to speak. In that moment, Elias understood. They were in this together. No matter how different they had found a way to survive. And more than that, they had found a way to thrive. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the clearing, Elias sat back and watched the fireflies dance in the air. The future was still uncertain. They had no way of knowing when, or if, help would come. But for the first time since the crash, Elias didn't feel quite as alone. He had Lyra, and together they could face whatever challenges the planet threw at them. The days on the alien planet continued to blur together. Dr. Elias West had long since stopped counting the hours or the number of days since the crash. Time felt different here, in this strange place where two suns hovered in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow across the land. He had learned to let go of the past and focus on the present, on survival, and on the quiet companionship of Lyra. Lyra was always beside him, a constant presence. She had become more than just an ally. She had become a guide, a protector, and a friend. Every day, she taught him something new: how to read the sky for changes in the weather, how to track the movement of the creatures in the forest, and how to find water when it seemed there was none. Today was no different. After breakfast, Lyra led Elias through the dense forest, her sharp eyes scanning the trees and the ground as they walked. Elias followed her, doing his best to keep up. He wasn't as fast as she was, and certainly not as skilled, but he had come a long way since they first met. He was learning to read the land, to anticipate the changes in the environment, and to understand what Lyra was trying to teach him. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh growth. The trees were unlike any he had seen before, tall, with wide, broad trunks and leaves that shimmered in the sunlight. It was a world full of life, but also full of hidden dangers. Elias had learned to tread carefully. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sound of running water reached their ears. Lyra gestured for Elias to follow her toward the source of the sound. They soon arrived at a wide stream that cut through the forest, its waters clear and flowing fast. Elias knelt by the edge, dipping his fingers into the cool water and feeling the smooth stones beneath the surface. "We've been here before," he said, looking up at Lyra. "But why did you bring me here again?" Lyra crouched beside him, her eyes glowing with quiet excitement. She pointed to the far side of the stream, where the trees grew thicker, their branches tangled together in a dense, almost impenetrable thicket. Then she made a sweeping gesture with her hand, signaling for Elias to follow her. Elias stood, curiosity sparking in his chest. "You want us to go there?" She nodded, her face serious, and began moving in that direction. Elias hesitated for a moment but then followed. There was something in her expression, something almost like a secret, that made him want to understand. He trusted her now, more than ever, and if she thought this was important, he had no reason to doubt her. As they reached the thicket, Lyra stopped and knelt. She pressed her hand against a thick vine that grew along the ground, and then gently pulled it back. Elias watched, intrigued, as a hidden path was revealed beneath the thick greenery. The path was narrow, and the vines seemed to guard it, but Lyra moved effortlessly, parting them with grace. Elias stepped forward, his heart racing with excitement. What was this hidden place? Why had Lyra brought him here? They moved through the path together, the vines curling back behind them as if they had never been disturbed. The air grew cooler as they entered the hidden part of the forest. The trees were taller here, their leaves glowing faintly in the dim light. The ground was covered in soft moss, and the silence was almost complete, save for the distant sound of the stream. Lyra led him to a large, smooth stone that lay in the center of the clearing. It was unlike anything Elias had seen before. The stone was covered in strange markings, patterns that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. Elias crouched down to inspect it, running his fingers gently over the surface. "What is this?" he whispered, more to himself than to Lyra. Lyra stood behind him, her gaze focused on the stone. She said something in her language, her voice soft, but the words were lost on Elias. He could sense the significance of this place, the weight of it. This stone was important to her. It was something beyond survival. It was a part of her history, part of her world. She stepped forward and placed her hand on the stone, as if communicating with it. Elias watched, fascinated, unsure of what to make of it. The markings on the stone glowed brighter as she touched it, and the air around them seemed to hum with energy. Lyra stepped back, then motioned for Elias to follow her. She led him to a small, narrow opening in the thicket, which opened up into a hidden cave. The cave was cool and dark, but inside, there were more markings on the walls, more of the same strange symbols that adorned the stone outside. Elias felt his heart race. This place, it felt ancient. It felt like something far older than anything he had ever known. "Why did you bring me here?" Elias asked, his voice trembling slightly with awe. He felt as though they had crossed into a space beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. Lyra turned to him and gave him a reassuring smile. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes told him everything he needed to know. This was a place of great importance to her, the place where answers might lie, answers about who she was and where she came from. Elias's mind raced. The questions he had held in his heart for so long were beginning to form. Who was Lyra, really? Why was she here? What connection did she have to this strange, alien planet? The answers, Elias realized, might be hidden in the very heart of this world. Answers that could change everything. The hidden cave was unlike anything Dr. Elias West had ever encountered. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed to glow with a soft, blue light, as if they were alive. The air inside the cave was cool and damp, yet it felt charged, like the energy of the place was almost palpable. Elias couldn't explain it, but something deep inside him told him that this was no ordinary cave. It was something ancient, something powerful. Lyra moved gracefully through the space, her eyes fixed on the markings as if they were calling to her. Elias followed her, trying to make sense of everything. She had brought him here, and it was clear that this place held great meaning for her. He could see it in the way she moved, the way her fingers traced the markings on the walls, as though they were familiar to her in a way he couldn't understand. "Lyra," Elias began, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this place?" Lyra turned to him, her expression serious. She didn't speak, but she motioned for him to follow. Elias could see that she was deeply connected to this place, as if it held answers that only she could understand. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. What was it that Lyra was trying to show him? They continued deeper into the cave, moving cautiously through the narrow passageways. The light from the markings on the walls seemed to grow stronger as they went, guiding their way forward. The deeper they went, the more Elias felt like they were moving through time itself. It was as if they were walking through the past, through the history of this alien world, and perhaps even through Lyra's own past. At the end of the cave, they reached a large chamber. The space was vast, with a high ceiling that seemed to disappear into the darkness above. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested a small, intricately carved object. It was a glowing crystal, its surface smooth and polished, pulsing with a soft light. Elias felt a strange pull toward it, as if the crystal was calling to him. Lyra stepped forward and placed her hand on the crystal. The moment she did, the room seemed to come alive. The markings on the walls brightened, and the air hummed with energy. Elias stood frozen, watching in awe as the crystal's light grew brighter, illuminating the entire chamber. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the crystal flickered, and Elias felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was as if the crystal was reaching out to him, trying to communicate something. He took a hesitant step forward, unsure of what to do. "Lyra, what's happening?" he asked, his voice shaking with wonder. Lyra turned to him, her eyes wide with the same awe that he felt. She reached out to him, placing a hand on his arm, as though offering reassurance. In that moment, Elias felt a deeper connection to her, an unspoken bond that seemed to transcend words, as if they were sharing a moment of understanding. For the first time, he realized that this was more than just survival. This was about something much greater, something that linked them both to the very heart of this planet. Elias hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, his hand slowly reaching out toward the crystal. As his fingers brushed against its surface, a surge of energy shot through him. It was like a wave of light, a flood of emotions and sensations that he couldn't control. He gasped, feeling a rush of memories that weren't his own, flashes of images, some distant and some more recent. He saw flashes of a starship crashing through the atmosphere, burning as it descended to the planet below. He saw Lyra, not as the quiet woman who had helped him survive, but as something different, something more. She was standing in front of a council of beings, her face filled with determination, her eyes glowing with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The images stopped as quickly as they had come, and Elias stumbled back, his breath coming in quick gasps. He looked at Lyra, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Lyra, what did I just see?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Was that your past?" Lyra stepped forward, her gaze steady. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes was enough. She nodded slowly, confirming what Elias had just experienced. It was her past, or at least a part of it. She had been part of something much larger than herself, something connected to the stars, something far beyond this planet. Elias's mind raced. The images had been so vivid, so real. What did they mean? What was this connection between Lyra, the crystal, and the ancient markings on the walls? And what did it all have to do with him? He turned back to the crystal, his mind still spinning. There had to be an answer here, an explanation that would bring everything into focus. But for now, it was clear that Lyra wasn't just a survivor on this alien world. She was part of something much greater, a piece of a larger story that Elias couldn't yet fully understand. As the light from the crystal dimmed, Elias stood in the silent chamber, his thoughts racing. Whatever had just happened, it had changed everything. They were no longer just two stranded survivors. They were part of something far more complicated, and the answers were just beginning to unfold. Lyra stepped closer, placing her hand on his shoulder once more. She didn't need words. The message was clear. They were in this together, and they would face whatever came next, whatever mysteries the planet held, side by side. The crystal's glow had faded, leaving behind a silence that seemed to echo through the cave. Dr. Elias West stood still, his mind racing with the images he had seen, the emotions that had flooded him. The vision had been clear. Lyra's past, her connection to something much greater than the planet they were stranded on. Yet the details were still shrouded in mystery, like pieces of a puzzle that had not yet been fully revealed. Lyra stood beside him, her presence quiet but comforting. She seemed unaffected by the vision, as though it was something she had experienced before. Elias looked at her, his thoughts tumbling over one another. What did it all mean? Why had the crystal shown him those images? And why had it chosen now to reveal them? Lyra, Elias said softly, his voice thick with the weight of his questions. Do you remember that? The vision. Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak, but her eyes, those glowing, almost otherworldly eyes, held something. A depth, an understanding. She gave him a small nod, acknowledging that she had felt it too, but Elias didn't know what more to say. She had been through so much, and he didn't want to push her too far, but he needed answers. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Lyra turned and gestured toward the entrance of the cave. It was as if she was silently telling him that it was time to leave, time to move forward. Elias hesitated for a moment, then nodded. They couldn't stay here forever. Whatever the crystal had shown them, they still had to face the challenges of the alien planet. They still had to survive. They left the cave together, the cool air outside greeting them like a welcome relief. The light from the two suns bathed the landscape in a warm golden hue, the vastness of the planet stretching out before them. There was still so much to explore, so much to learn. But now, Elias felt a new sense of urgency. He couldn't ignore the vision he had seen, nor the connection between Lyra and this strange planet. He had to understand what it all meant. As they walked through the forest, Elias could feel a growing unease in the pit of his stomach. The planet was beautiful, but it wasn't the home he had known. It was alien in every sense of the word, and now it felt as though the planet itself was watching them, as if it held secrets just beyond their reach. He had been on this world for what felt like months now, but the more he learned, the more he realized how little he knew. He had no way of knowing if anyone was looking for them, if anyone knew they were stranded here. Lyra's past was still a mystery, and the vision he had experienced only deepened the questions that had been building ever since they crash-landed. The forest around them began to change as they walked. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting in strange, intricate patterns. The ground beneath their feet became softer, almost spongy. The air grew heavier, and Elias noticed that the sounds of the forest had changed. The usual rustling of leaves and chirping of distant creatures had faded, replaced by a heavy, almost eerie silence. "What's happening?" Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lyra stopped walking, her eyes scanning the area around them. She raised her hand, signaling for Elias to be quiet. He followed her gaze, trying to make sense of what was happening. The air was still, the trees unnaturally quiet. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Suddenly, from the shadows of the trees, something moved. Elias tensed, his heart racing. It was a shape, large and dark, slipping between the trunks of the trees. He couldn't make out any details, but the movement was too fluid, too deliberate to be just another animal. Lyra stood motionless, her body tense, her eyes focused on the shadow. Elias didn't speak. He simply stood there, waiting, watching. He could feel the tension in the air, the quiet hum of something ancient and powerful. The shadow moved again, this time closer, and Elias caught a glimpse of it. A figure, tall and thin, with dark skin that seemed to blend with the shadows around it. It had the grace of something otherworldly, something not of this planet. Lyra finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Stay close." Elias nodded, his body on high alert. He stayed right behind Lyra as she led him through the thickening trees, her every step careful and deliberate. They moved quickly but quietly, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. The figure in the shadows continued to follow them, keeping its distance. It was clear that it was aware of them, but it didn't seem to be in a hurry to confront them. Elias felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't know what this creature wanted, but he could sense that it was no mere animal. Lyra's steps grew more confident as they approached a clearing. The moment they stepped into the open, the figure stopped, as if waiting for them to make the first move. Elias could see it more clearly now, its tall form standing still like a statue in the shadows of the trees. Its features were sharp, angular, and covered in what appeared to be markings similar to the ones in the cave. "What is it?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her gaze locked with the figure. She raised her hand, making a gesture that Elias had seen before, a silent command, a sign of respect. The figure responded in kind, raising its hand in a similar gesture. For a moment, the two stood in silence, as if exchanging some unspoken communication. Then, with a swift movement, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Lyra, his mind racing with questions. Who was that? Lyra looked at him, her expression serious but not fearful. "A guardian," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "A protector of this world." Elias's heart skipped a beat. They were not alone here. This planet, this alien world, was alive in ways he hadn't yet understood. And the more he uncovered, the more he realized how much danger and how much wonder this world held. The forest was quiet now. The strange figure, the guardian as Lyra had called it, had vanished into the shadows, leaving no trace behind. Elias stood in the clearing, his mind racing with questions. Who or what was that being? And what had it wanted from them? Lyra seemed unfazed by the encounter. She stood still, her gaze fixed on the spot where the figure had disappeared, her posture calm but alert. Elias watched her, wondering what thoughts were running through her mind. After everything they had already faced, he was beginning to understand just how much she had been through, and how much she had yet to reveal. Elias cleared his throat. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. "What do we do next?" Lyra turned to him, her eyes soft but serious. She didn't need to say anything. She simply gestured for him to follow her. And so, they continued walking through the forest, the silence between them comfortable but filled with unspoken thoughts. The encounter with the guardian had left Elias with more questions than answers. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward this world. The connection between Lyra and the planet was becoming clearer, and so was the fact that their survival was no longer the only thing that mattered. There was something bigger at play here, something that tied them both to this strange, alien world in ways he couldn't yet understand. As they walked, the forest began to change again. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and twisted, and the air grew cooler. Elias noticed that the path before them was becoming more difficult to navigate. The ground was uneven, covered in thick vines and tangled roots. But Lyra moved through the forest with ease, as if she were at home here. Elias followed her, doing his best to keep up. After a time, they reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone structure, ancient and weathered by time. It was a monument of some kind, covered in the same glowing symbols that Elias had seen in the cave. The symbols pulsed faintly, their glow brighter than before. Lyra stopped in front of the structure, her eyes scanning the surface of the stone. Elias approached slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it, the place he had been waiting for. The answers, he hoped, would be here. Lyra reached out and touched one of the symbols, her fingers brushing against the stone. The moment she made contact, a low hum filled the air, and the symbols on the monument began to glow brighter. Elias took a step back, watching in awe as the monument seemed to come to life, its surface shifting, the symbols rearranging themselves before his eyes. "This is it," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the heart of the planet, the source of its power." Elias's heart skipped a beat. The heart of the planet. What did she mean by that? He stepped closer, drawn to the monument as if it were calling to him. The glowing symbols seemed to reach out to him, their light pulling him in, urging him to understand. Lyra stepped aside, giving him space. "It is time, Elias," she said, her voice steady. "Time for you to see the truth." Elias nodded, his breath catching in his throat. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. He placed his hand on the stone, where Lyra's fingers had been just moments before. As soon as he made contact, a flood of sensations filled his mind. The world around him disappeared, replaced by flashes of images of vast cities, of starships soaring through the sky, of beings not like Lyra, but similar to her. He saw a great council of beings, their eyes glowing with the same light that emanated from the symbols on the monument. They were speaking, communicating in a language that Elias couldn't understand, but the emotion behind their words was clear, a sense of urgency, of purpose. Then the images shifted. He saw a great disaster, a cataclysmic event that had torn the fabric of this world apart. The planet had been on the brink of collapse, and the beings who had once ruled it had vanished. But some, like Lyra, had survived, carrying with them the knowledge of the past and the hope for the future. Elias pulled his hand away from the stone, his chest heaving as he tried to process what he had just experienced. The images had been overwhelming, and yet they had answered many of his questions. Lyra was not just a survivor of a crash. She was part of something far larger, something tied to the very foundation of this planet. And now, Elias was part of it too. He turned to Lyra, his eyes wide with realization. "The planet," he whispered. "It's not just a place. It's alive, isn't it?" Lyra nodded slowly. "It is. The planet is a living being, just as we are. And its people, the ones who came before, left behind their legacy. The knowledge, the power." Elias's mind was reeling. This was more than he had ever imagined. The answers were now in his hands, but they raised even more questions. What did the planet want from him? What role did he play in all of this? "Lyra," Elias said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "What do we do now?" Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "Now we find our way home. Together, we bring the knowledge of the past into the future, and we ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated." Elias nodded, the weight of her words settling into his heart. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wasn't alone. Lyra had become his guide, his companion, and together they would face whatever challenges came next. The planet was alive, and its secrets were theirs to uncover. But Elias knew that the journey was far from over. The path ahead would be long and full of uncertainty. Yet, with Lyra by his side, he felt ready to face whatever the universe threw their way. Together, they would write the next chapter of this world's story. And together, they would discover the true power of the stars.